Hey guys. It's my first time when I've actually used notes for one of these things, so I don't really know, like, should I look at the notes or should I look at you? I think I might just put them there. Yeah, we're off script. So I'm going to talk about the city in particular, so urban spaces and how games deal with them in some ways. So the first thing I want to talk about is actually not a game, well, I guess it is a game in a way, Westfield shopping centre. How many of you are familiar with Westfield? I like that, ooh, yeah. Yeah, the weight of capitalism. So Westfield Shopping Centre, there's an author I really like, Darren Anderson. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he talks about shopping centres as liminal spaces. So spaces that, like, liminality is this idea of like being in between. So you're not actually kind of in one thing or the other. It's this kind of constant liminal space. And he talks about them in terms of pathogens, like a virus. And he says they started like in kind of airports or little chefs kind of on the motorway, and then they kind of travel along the veins and then start to infect the cities. And then you have big shopping centres kind of, you know, pop up, kind of pleasantly neutral spaces that are meant to be quite comfortable but are actually massively alienating. You never kind of get a sense of kind of historical identity, and you never get a sense of kind of regional identity. The idea is that they're the same in Britain as they are in China, as they are in India. They're just kind of neutral capitalist spaces. And I think the psychological effect of walking through these spaces is quite oppressive in a way. You might not consciously feel oppressed by it, but there's this sense that you're never really in a place, you're always moving somewhere. And this is kind of, you know, encouraged by what's in the shops. I mean, you're always working towards the next iPhone, you're always working towards the next product. It's always this kind of constant cycle. And it's quite uncomfortable. So I think games kind of relish the pleasure of these places being destroyed. There's a perverse pleasure in this destruction, because suddenly this kind of outside of time, this timelessness is kind of focused on a plane of existence that you just have to survive. Suddenly you don't have to worry about this constant liminal sense of moving towards the next thing, being between spaces. You are completely present in a space and you have to survive. I think there is a pleasure with that, and I think games really tap into that pleasure. So this is from The Division. Also, I mean, there's lots of games that do it. Oh, did I turn this off? It's on. This is The Last of Us. Again, it's a similar thing, the idea that these playgrounds of, playgrounds of capital suddenly become playgrounds in a more literal sense, this playground that you're able to, in some ways, master yourself. So I want to use a quote from a philosopher called Louis Morin. He was writing about Thomas More's Utopia. He's talking about catastrophe is the sublime way to open a neutral space, one that is absolutely different. So what Morin says here, this idea of catastrophe, opening a space that in some ways is completely separate from all the kind of day-to-day worries or the kind of the troubles or this weight of capital. In a more kind of broad sense, this is the kind of appeal of big blockbusters, big kind of, you know, things where London gets blown up or New York gets blown up or Washington. And there is a perverse pleasure in this because obviously these are very historically kind of prescient at the moment. It's a very kind of thing that we're all very aware of. Yet there is this idea that living in a city and all its complexities and all its kind of different systems can be massively simplified because we just have to survive, we just have to subsist if something catastrophic happens. And that's the appeal of kind of films like London Has Fallen, who I've not seen. Has anyone seen it? Maybe it's not about this at all, so ignore me. Okay. And it's, you know, it's appeal to some degree to kind of games. Nothing against Call of Duty and games like that, but it is this, the appeal in some ways comes from this. Taking a city or an urban environment, which is a massively complex, very difficult, troubling thing, and making it simple, making it kind of exist on a plane that you're able to deal with, and you are in a position, importantly, where you're empowered and you are able to deal with it. Suddenly all the barriers fall down and you are able to go wherever you want, save the day, save the city as a kind of thing that you're able to hold. So I just want to maybe go back a bit more about this tendency towards comprehension. So games, this idea of understanding the city and making it seem simple and negotiable, obviously has a long literary heritage. So the idea of a character being a comprehending force, we can kind of go really far back to that. So if you think about myths or like the idea of dragon slayers or knights, the idea is that the human kind of hero is a comprehending force. So the monsters in this case are kind of irrational, or they can't be understood, or there's something, obviously wrong and perverse with them. But the kind of human hero is able to go into them and make sense of it, literally by killing them or punching them in the face or something in this sense. But the idea that the hero is a comprehending force. I mean, if you think about, this is an illustration from Beowulf. I don't know how many of you read Beowulf, it's really great. Yeah, Beowulf! And Grendel, the monster, who's fantastic, is in some, there's lots of different ways to analyze it, but a lot of people like to analyze Grendel as being in some ways like a perverse version of a man. Like it takes the kind of masculine identity and makes it something kind of dark and kind of hyperbolic and strange. And Beowulf kind of makes sense of this literally by ripping its arm off and kind of comprehending it. So that's a while ago. So this is the monster that maybe the modern character has to deal with. The idea maybe previously where you're living in relatively rural communities, you have a certain set of fears. And if we fast forward to the 19th century, urban centres like London grow massively. There's a figure I have, but I've thrown it on the floor, so I'm just going to make it up. But at the beginning of the 19th century, there's something like 1 million people, and then by the end of it, there's something like 7 million people or something. Anyway, it's a enormous. That's probably not true. So, but it's on the floor, and I feel like it would break a certain decision if I picked it up and flicked through to it. London got a lot bigger in the 19th century. And the fears, the idea of monsters suddenly become different in an urban setting. Suddenly what is incomprehensible and confusing is the city itself, or what happens in the city, the kind of different characters in that. So it's around this time that you have the detective. So the detective starts to appear, and the detective is in some ways a continuation of that hero figure, that comprehending force. But instead of beating up a monster, he rationalizes the situation. So generally seen as like the first detective story is by Edgar Allan Poe, Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is really great, you should read it. And then that introduced this idea of, I think it's ratiocination, well, again it's on the floor so I'm not going to say it properly, but it's the idea which, if you're familiar with Sherlock Holmes, you'll be familiar with, where observing things and then making this kind of chain of conclusions that lead up to some like, oh my God, Holmes, how did you know he was from the Arctic? The snow. So anyway, so that figure, so that tendency to have a kind of rationalizing figure, that's in the 19th century. A lot of games then deal with this in a, you have games like Broken Sword that deal with it in a very direct way. They are basically a continuation of a detective novel, because in a way a detective novel is a game in itself. The idea is to work out who done it to some degree. And this kind of goes back to this idea of catastrophe as well, that if you've played Broken Sword, it starts with essentially a terrorist act on a cafe in Paris, which again takes on a much darker tone when we read it in that way today. But suddenly when that happens, everything becomes a game. I mean, of course it becomes a game because it's a game, but everything suddenly becomes a very ordered game. And there's a fantasy in that, that something that is quite an extreme catastrophic act suddenly levels everything. And George Stobart, I think his name, you're not a policeman, you're just kind of there, and suddenly you are empowered and able to kind of make sense of things and combine items and talk to people. And there is an appeal in that. There's an appeal in being in a situation and it being kind of flattened, and suddenly you're able to make sense of it. In a less direct sense, something like Assassin's Creed, it's really interesting, not just because spatially you have a lot of freedom, but historically it kind of makes sense of everything. So you go to kind of big cities like Paris or London or Rome, which, again, if you're living in them, there might be a sense that you're weighed down by a sense of history, that there's so many different layers of history kind of piled on top of each other like rocks, that it can be a bit terrifying and ominous. Whereas in Assassin's Creed, you're able to spatially do whatever you want and make sense of the city in that sense, but you're also able to historically meet all these historical characters in quite an ordered sense and get quests from them and then go here. And it's appealing because it makes sense of history, which is great, but it appeals to that fantasy that we want to be able to make sense of things, and urban environments are massively confusing. And this idea of being able to make sense of those environments. Even something like Manifold Garden by William Sher, which is great. It's coming out soon. It looks, I think that's does this work? Yeah. So it's the idea of the game is it's kind of in the vein of kind of puzzle games like Portal and Antechamber, but you negotiate these massive looping architectures which seem incomprehensible to begin with. It looks like this massive incomprehensible structure, but the movement is towards comprehension. So you move from this massive, looping, sprawling building, and then you find your route through it. And he's actually been very clever in flagging different ways for you to make your way through it. William used to be a physicist, or I think he definitely studied physics, and then he went into kind of art and game design, and he talks about how this game in some way is a metaphor for the progression of physics over the past 100 years or so. And this idea, I guess, is the idea of a movement towards comprehension, towards making sense of something, towards looking at something that might on the outset seem incomprehensible and making it comfortable mapping it. So that's all great, but there's also the idea of what's in the city. That you might have these environments that make it easy to facilitate some type of rational mapping, but there's always things that go wrong. And one thing which I really love are glitches. So, I mean, Assassin's Creed's great for this. This is from The Division. That there might be this giant map that you're able to explore, but things go wrong, or something in the code breaks down, or something. Maybe it's other players if it's a multiplayer game. I think there's a slide from Grand Theft Auto. This idea of when you're actually negotiating these environments, they might seem to make sense, but there's things that are quite uncanny and irrational that kind of break through that, which I think is quite beautiful. And one thing I then just want to end on, which I'm going to have to read, so excuse me, this is slightly wanky, but fuck it, is I just want to show that idea of something incomprehensible breaking through by the actual inhabitants of the city isn't new. So I just want to read a brief poem. Yeah, poetry. Which is by Charles Baudelaire. So Charles Baudelaire is I just want to read this because I love this poem, so it's mainly an excuse to read this poem. He was a French writer who was living in Paris, 19th century, and he was writing this particular poem at a time when Paris was being transformed. So the kind of old Paris, or the kind of winding streets, were being kind of torn down and replaced with big, wide kind of avenues. And there's a lot of kind of political implications, you know, the idea that it's harder to make barricades when you have wider streets. But he's kind of lamenting the old Paris and how it's being replaced with, in some ways, this like liminal space, this idea of this quite neutral space, but then also kind of what I think is a glitch. So this is a glitch he sees in the city. I'll just maybe go down like this. So it's called The Seven Old Men. I don't know if any of you know this poem. No? Okay. Oh, shit. Oh, swarming city, city full of dreams, where in a full day the spectre walks and speaks. Mighty Colossus, in your narrow veins my story flows, as flows the rising sap. One morn, disputed with my tired soul, and like a hero stiffening all my nerves, I trod a suburb shaken by the jar of rolling wheels, where the fog magnified the houses either side of that sad street, so they seemed like two wharves the ebbing flood leaves desolate by the riverside. A mist, unclean and yellow, inundated space, a scene that would have pleased an actor's soul. Then suddenly, an aged man, whose rags were yellow as the rainy sky, whose looks should have brought arms in floods upon his head, without the misery gleaming in his eye, appeared before me, and his pupils seemed to have been washed with gall. The bitter frost sharpened his glance, and from his chin a beard sword-stiff and jagged, Judas-like, struck forth. He was not bent, but broken. His backbone made a so true right angle with his legs, that as he walked, the tapping stick which gave the finish to the picture made him seem like some infirm and stumbling quadruped, or a three-legged Jew. Through stone and mud he walked with troubled and uncertain gait, as though his Shabbats trod upon the dead, indifferent and hostile to the world. His double followed him, tatters and stick and back and eye and beard, all were the same, out of the same hell, indistinguishable, these twins, these spectres odd, trod the same pace towards some end unknown. To what fell complot was I then exposed, humiliated by what evil chance? For as the minutes one by one went by, 7 times I saw this sinister old man repeat his image there before my eyes. Let him who smiles at my inquietude, who never trembled at a fear like mine, know that in their decrepitudes, despite these 7 old hideous monsters, had the main of beings immortal. Then, I thought, must I, undying, contemplate the awful 8th, inexorable, fatal, and ironic double, disgusting phoenix, father of himself and his own son. In terror then I turned my back upon the infernal band, and fled to my own place, and closed my door distraught, and like a drunkard who sees all things twice, with feverish troubled spirits, chilly and sick, wounded by mystery and absurdity. In vain my reason tried to cross the bar, the whirring storm but drove her back again, and my soul tossed and tossed, an outworn wreck, mastless upon a monstrous shoreless sea. Anyway, there you go. There's a little bit about me, so I'll do something. Okay, thank you.